All right, good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and welcome to Mods Save Our Seas Distinguished Speaker Series. Thank you for joining us. I know it's always a little difficult to log on in a virtual setting. It's so much nicer to be able to welcome an amazing scientist like Tonya at Mods and have this experience in person. But thank you so much for joining us. Mods is doing everything we can, striving to deliver virtual content to you, and not interrupt all of our programming. So thank you so much for being part of it. This program is sponsored by the Save Our Seas Foundation, who make all of this possible. A little bit about our logistics for tonight's program. If you have any questions or if anything comes up, please go ahead and put those into the chat. And you can chat those directly to the entire group. And that way everybody can see your questions. If you have questions for Tonya tonight, you can put them in there. The way we have our structure set up, you see Hillary Wallace, also from Mods. Hi, Hillary.
Hi.
So Hillary is our events director, and she's helping us to facilitate the program tonight. So I also did not introduce myself. I'm David Rahaheti Webb. I am the Director of Education at Mods. So the process for this is, as the program goes, if you have any really good questions, we don't want to impede on you asking them, or maybe you forget them when we get to the Q&A section at the end. So please go ahead and put those questions into the chat, and then Hillary will make sure that all of those get funneled directly to me. And when we get to the Q&A portion after Tanya's presentation, we will go ahead and read those to Tonya and get her responses. So tonight, I've mentioned Tonya's here with us, but Tonya Wiley is the president of Havenworth Coastal Conservation. And during her presentation tonight, Tonya is going to share a detailed history of sawfish, specifically in Florida. So I know all of us Floridians, most of us have probably never seen a sawfish. If you guys, on your Zoom reaction, if you want to raise your hand if you've ever seen a sawfish, I would absolutely love to see how many people may have. I myself have seen one sawfish growing up. I grew up on Sanibel Island, and I saw one in Estero Bay, believe it or not, the one and only time. Florida sawfish, they are an endangered species, the smalltooth sawfish, and Tonya and other scientists are really striving to learn as much about them as they can so we can protect them out in their habitat. They are really a keystone species. And for Tonya's talk, she's going to go ahead and start her presentation now, sharing her PowerPoint, and sit back and enjoy. Thank you.
All right. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you, David and Hillary, for putting this on tonight. And thank you all for showing up and spending part of your evening with me to learn about endangered sawfish. All right. So I always start off with just a basic explanation of what a sawfish is, because as David mentioned, most of us have never seen one, unfortunately. But sawfish are a very large, distinctive type of ray. And you can see here a couple pictures of sawfish. And rays have their gill slits on the underside of the body. You can see that here from this sawfish at the Dallas World Aquarium. Sharks have their gill slits on the side of their bodies, but sawfish and rays have their gill slits on the underside of the body, so that makes sawfish a type of ray. You can see here why they're called a sawfish, right? They've got this hedge trimmer on the front. We call it a rostrum. There are 5 species of sawfish found around the world. And historically, in the United States, we used to have 2 species, the smalltooth sawfish, which is this one, and the largetooth sawfish, which is this one on the bottom. At one time, both species were considered quite abundant and common in waters of the United States. So that's what a sawfish is. Now I'm going to talk about what a sawfish is not. So we get a lot of people sending us reports of these animals, so I just want to make sure you know now what sawfish are not. So here's a saw shark, and as I mentioned before, sharks have their gill slits on the side of their body, so that makes this one a saw shark. They're a deeper water animal. This is a sword fish. This is a bony fish, has one gill opening here on the side of their head, swordfish. We get a lot of people think this is what I work on, but paddlefish, which are really cool. I hope someday to see one, but not sawfish. One that we are likely to see fishing here in Florida are needlefish, much smaller. Bony fish, again, have one gill opening on the side of their head. Gar, and sawtooth shark. We hear this one a lot. There is actually no such thing as a sawtooth shark. Again, sawfish are rays, not sharks. And sawtooth is actually a mountain range out in Idaho, not an animal that swims in the ocean. So I mentioned that we had 2 species of sawfish here in the United States, and I have a side-by-side comparison here of the 2 species. The easiest way for us and anyone to tell them apart is by the number of teeth on the rostrum. The smalltooth sawfish here on the left has 22 to 29 on each side of the saw. And what's interesting is the number of teeth that they have on the saw is actually set during development. And they can vary by as much as 3. One individual might have 23 on one side and 25 on the other, or 26 on one side and 29 on the other. So when we catch sawfish, we count those teeth. That's one way that we can distinguish individuals when we catch them together. You can also see here on the largetooth sawfish, which has 16 to 20 teeth on either side of the saw. The base here is much wider than the tip. The smalltooth sawfish is almost the same width all the way down, but the largetooth sawfish is much, much wider here at the base. So there's some other differences with fin placement, but this is the easiest way to tell the 2 species apart. So historically, these range maps in red show where the species were once found. So the smalltooth sawfish here in the United States was found from Texas here all the way through the Gulf of Mexico around to Florida and up as far as North Carolina. We even had some sawfish landed in New York. We don't know where they originated from, but were landed in New York, but we kind of consider the historic range up through North Carolina. And this species was always more common in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, as opposed to the largetooth sawfish over here. You can see there's not as much red on this map for largetooth sawfish. This one was found only in the Gulf of Mexico and mostly west of the Mississippi, predominantly, almost exclusively in Texas waters. So I put these photos in here because I really wanted to give you guys a sense of the history of sawfish in Florida. And if we have anyone on here tonight who's not from Florida, sorry, focus on the talk here on Florida, but we have these same kind of pictures for all the Gulf states and even some from Georgia, North and South Carolina, but focusing on Florida this evening. So when we started doing the work on sawfish, the first thing we did was dive into these old records. We looked in newspapers and library archives to get a sense of where sawfish used to be found and when they were found in different places. So I put up some of these really fun old pictures for you guys to get a sense of how big sawfish were and just how common they used to be. So here's a few throughout Florida. Naples was an area that historically and even currently we get a lot of sawfish reports. This photo to me tells a big story because if you see my cursor, here is one of the fishermen standing here. And here's where the sawfish start and his saw goes all the way up to here. So that's how big this sawfish was caught in Naples. Here is a tarpon hanging here. That probably is a really good sized tarpon because they kept it to take a picture of it, but it looks tiny here next to all of these really large sawfish, but really puts in perspective with the man standing here just how big these sawfish get. A couple historic ones. We have a whole bunch of photos from the 1950s from Naples Pier of people catching sawfish. Daytona up here, this one already had its saw removed, and you can see here's a little kid down in Key West at a fishing camp who was selling sawfish roster to tourists. You know, now you can go into Shell World or almost any tourist shop and buy shells and you know, other ocean artifacts. And this boy here was selling sawfish rosters to tourists as souvenirs. Stewart over there by y'all, and Cedar Key here on the Gulf Coast, here where I am. I'm actually in Tampa Bay, at the very south end of Tampa Bay, in a little town called Palmetto. And so these are some over my neck of the woods here in St. Petersburg on an old railroad trestle pier. They redid the pier for the, I don't know how many time, but this was one of the original piers here. Here's an old newspaper article about a sawfish that was caught 14 feet 6 inches, weighed 660 pounds. Again, you look at these guys standing here and just how big these sawfish were. It's just incredible to look back at some of these old pictures. Here's Palmetto, right where I am, in Manatee River, where I do a lot of work on sharks. A couple old sawfish here. I love how people got so dressed up to go fishing. You know, we're spoiled to our Columbia shirts that, you know, wick, but boy, back in the day, they used to get fancy to go fishing. It cracks me up looking at these old pictures. So these two pictures are really unique and told us a lot when we found these. So this one was an old postcard of a sawfish, and you can see here there's two little baby sawfish, fully formed little baby sawfish laying on the mother here. And in this photo, this one's from Melbourne, there's 11 baby sawfish hanging in this picture. So this picture here was the first evidence that we had of how many young sawfish have in a litter, because in this picture we were able to count 11 of these little baby sawfish. And this sawfish is so big. Here's the tail, here's the head. The saw's not even in the picture up here, but you know, huge sawfish. This picture is from the Florida Keys in the 1940s, and again, men in three-piece wool suits up here fishing. But this picture here really tells the story of sawfish in Florida, kind of in one photograph. So it shows how common sawfish used to be, because on this side of the boat we can count 30 sawfish. Who knows what on the other side of the boat, or you know, in the boat, but just hanging on this side of the boat there are 30 sawfish. Here's the largest one here, and then there's several little baby sawfish hanging up here. So you know, this picture sums up how common sawfish used to be, but then kind of what happened to sawfish, because people would go out and catch so many of them, you know, just in one day. This photo is our Florida State record sawfish. So it was caught in Florida Bay in 1961. It's 648 pounds and 15 feet 4 inches. So we know that there have been, from some of these photographs and log books, longer sawfish caught in Florida, but records are done by weight. So they have to be officially weighed. And this one was actually put on a boat trailer in Flamingo and trailered over to Fort Lauderdale to be officially weighed. So here is our Florida State record sawfish. So the largetooth sawfish, that one was very common, again, in the early 1900s, but by the mid 1950s was already severely depleted. We just weren't seeing them show up very much in newspaper articles. Here's from 1940, a picture of two sawfish from Galveston, Texas, where I went to college. This species was last confirmed in Florida in 1943, and the last one in all of the United States was in Texas in 1961. So it's been 60 years since we have any evidence of this species being in U.S. waters, so we consider this one to be locally extinct, unfortunately. The smalltooth sawfish is doing a little better, thankfully. So when we started, again, digging up all these records from newspapers and magazines and log books to determine where sawfish were, we made these beautiful maps here. So each yellow dot is where someone caught or saw a sawfish. And these records go all the way back to 1782. We had almost 3,500 records of sawfish here in the United States. So when we map these, This red area is where 50% of those records were from. So this is South Florida, 10,000 Islands, Everglades National Park, and up to about Fort Lauderdale here. This is where half of these records were historically. This blue area is where 90% of the records were. And this goes just up past Tampa Bay here where I am. So this is all the way back, all the records from 1782. Now, when we fast forward and we only look at records from 1964 to present, you go back one so you can see sawfish used to be all the way up here. Here's that one that was landed in New York. But sawfish were all the way up the Atlantic seaboard throughout the Gulf of Mexico. When we fast forward and we only look at records from 1964 to current, you can see we've lost sawfish from the Atlantic seaboard here north of Florida, and kind of barely hanging on in a little pocket over here in the middle Texas coast. And even this little red dot and the blue dot, both of those have shrank a little bit, focusing more on South Florida. And then we fast forward, now we're only looking at records from 1990 to 2000, and now sawfish are limited to peninsular Florida, and mostly 10,000 Islands and Everglades National Park down here in the south. So what happened? How is it possible that we had this big, beautiful animal, two species that were swimming around, and now we've lost one, and one is, you know, barely hanging on in South Florida? Well, the main reasons were from fishing mortality. They were a great sport fish. I showed you all those pictures. People would catch sawfish, hang them up for the photo. Most of the time they would cut the saw off and keep that as a trophy. But they were also caught as bycatch in shrimp trawls and gill nets. So once we humans started fishing with nets, gill nets, shrimp trawls, cast nets, sawfish are so easily tangled in a net. Here's a sawfish in a shrimp trawl. But this rostrum makes them so easily tangled in a net, which is great for us when we're doing research. But you know, most of the fishermen considered them a nuisance because the sawfish would tear the net, or you know, the fishermen didn't want to cut the net, get the sawfish out. So most sawfish were killed in order to remove them from the nets. They also have very low reproductive potential. And what that means is that unlike a bony fish, like a trout or a redfish that spawn thousands of eggs, sawfish give birth to fully formed young. And as I mentioned earlier, only about a dozen. And so we were taking them out of the population at a much faster rate than they were able to replenish that population. And then also destruction of inshore nursery habitat. So the very young, small sawfish, they're born about 2 feet long, and they'll be in really shallow water right up along the mangrove, which is a lot of the area that we've developed. And I have a great video here that hopefully is going to play. Yay! All right. So here's an aerial photo taken by Michael Scholl when he was with Save Our Seas Foundation down in the 10,000 Island. Here's a little baby sawfish. And this shows you just how shallow sawfish are. And you know, here's the mangrove fringe. This guy is in like ankle deep water. And that's to avoid the sharks that are swimming in the deeper water down here. Beautiful picture here. You can see how the dorsal fin here moves. We actually had a problem trying to put satellite tags on them because that dorsal fin would lay over and the satellite tags wouldn't be able to break through the surface of the water. Beautiful video here. Oh, I could just watch this all day. And here's 2 sawfish. So here's one here and here's one here. So you can see it's low tide. The water's not up in the mangrove. But the sawfish are going to follow that shallow water up into the mangrove. And they'll actually swim in and among the mangrove prop roots. Again, there's food available for them up there, but it's to avoid the predators, the sharks, alligators or crocodiles down in Everglades National Park that we've seen pictures of baby sawfish in bull sharks. So they seek refuge in that shallow water and those mangrove prop roots to avoid those predators. So there were also a lot of uses for sawfish and sawfish parts. The last numbers we have from the aquarium trade, because they're now protected, But live sawfish were selling for the aquarium trade about $1,700 a foot. You get the 10-foot long sawfish, and that's a pretty good paycheck right there for you. Here's a beautiful picture taken by Alan Henningsen at the National Aquarium in Baltimore. The fins of sawfish are also highly prized for shark fin soup. Their fins are, the texture of them is considered very favorable. They're considered white fins. And here's an example of a caudal fin, or the tail fin here. This is a tail fin, what we call the caudal fin. So here's a photograph here of a tail fin of a sawfish that was confiscated in Indonesia in trade. That had sold for $3,000. This one tail fin for shark fin soup. And I mentioned that people would keep the saws when they caught a sawfish as a trophy. But a lot of people also bought them as souvenirs, like that young kid who was selling them at the fish camp in Key West. And we still see them for sale on eBay and Craigslist, things like that. They are an endangered species, so selling their parts is illegal. So I don't recommend trying to sell them or buy them online anymore. Some of a couple unique uses for sawfish. One of them is the cockfighting industry down in Central and South America. So they actually take the rostral teeth from the saw, and they'll slice them in half long ways here and attach these anchors here, and they'll affix them to the legs of the cock for cockfighting to give them some artificial spurs. There's been some NGOs who are trying to develop artificial ones of these, or 3D print ones of these to replace this use for sawfish parts. But just to give you an example, these would sell for about $133 a pair. And because there's 20 to 29 teeth on each side of the rostrum, one rostrum could be worth almost $7,000 just for these artificial spurs for cockfighting. In Asia, they do sell sawfish rostra in pharmacies. They're ground up to make medicine. And another unique use for them is as ceremonial weapons. So you can see here a lot of these sawfish rostrum have all been decorated. They've had handles affixed to them. They were used as weapons, but they'll paint them or they'll inlay them with gold, sometimes put their family crest on here to tell a story. And two undecorated, no handles, no decoration, no painting, sold about 15 years ago for the US equivalent of $80,000 in Taiwan for these ceremonial weapons. So you can see here how the value of sawfish in a lot of places is quite high for their parts. Historically, the skin was used for leather. In some countries, they did use them for meat or use them for bait. So in Florida, they were very proactive. Sawfish largely declined unnoticed. I mean, really the only people who were noticing were the fishermen who were kind of happy they were declining anyway. And in 1992, FWC, the state of Florida, listed both species of sawfish as catch and release species only. In 1995, I added this, Florida instituted the inshore gill net ban. That was not done for sawfish, but has greatly helped sawfish in their recovery. So that's why it has an asterisk here, because it didn't have anything to do with sawfish when they instituted that inshore gill net ban. In 1999, NOAA Fisheries received a petition to list both species of sawfish as endangered species. That's when I came on. I was working for Texas Parks and Wildlife at the time, moved to Florida here to start a job at Mote Marine Laboratory. And that's when we started the status review, that's a deep dive into all those photographs and library records. And in 2000, that status review was completed. That's when those maps went through that I showed you. And in 2003, the smalltooth sawfish was listed as an endangered species. We didn't list the largetooth sawfish at that time, but thankfully we did in 2014. So now both species of sawfish, smalltooth and largetooth sawfish, are federally protected catch and release in federal waters, and they're protected in state waters in most of the states, including Florida, which was the first to start it in 1992. I thought I took this picture out, but I left it in. So we have a recovery team that gets together every year to monitor our recovery plan and see how we're doing, talk about our research, what we've learned, develop our objectives for the upcoming year. So here's a picture of us about 20 years ago. For those of you who remember Flamingo before the hurricanes of 2004 wiped out Flamingo, we used to stay at Flamingo in the lodge and the cabins down there. And here's a picture of us eating in the restaurant under the visitor center at Flamingo. One of the last times we were there before Flamingo got destroyed, unfortunately. Here we are recently in Key Largo. We had a billboard up for a while, a couple years ago, and photo there. So we get together, like I said, once a year to monitor our progress towards conserving and recovering sawfish and plan our objectives for the following year. So there's several of us that do field research on sawfish. So here's me. I'm up in Tampa Bay, south end of Tampa Bay here, focusing on this region. The state, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, works in Charlotte Harbor and that area on both juveniles and some adults that they're getting here off Sanibel. NOAA Fisheries from Panama City is focusing on the 10,000 Islands and Everglades National Park area on the juvenile surveys. That was that drone footage you saw of their surveys that they were doing there. And Florida State University Coastal and Marine Lab is doing a lot of the work on the adult sawfish for us, mostly down here in the Keys, in Florida Bay, and starting to expand up here on the Atlantic coast, because we're starting to get some good reports from fishermen and divers of seeing some sawfish up here. We don't have any full-time directed projects on sawfish on this part of the coast yet, but we do have a lot of colleagues who do research on sharks, and occasionally will catch sawfish for us and are able to tag them for us. So when we catch a sawfish, of course, we're very excited because we managed to catch an endangered species, which is challenging in itself, but we take a lot of measurements of them, of course. We measure the saw or the rostrum here against several different lengths of the body. And what we have found for the smalltooth sawfish here in the United States is that the saw, the rostrum, is about 20 to 25% of the overall length of the body. And it's usually around 23%. So when we get an isolated rostra that someone had bought as a souvenir or kept as a trophy, we can measure the saw and get an estimate of how long the overall animal was. We determine what sex it is. So sharks and rays, the males have these two organs called claspers that they use for mating. So we're able to just look externally and determine if the sawfish are male or female. Here's a larger sawfish, this is how big the claspers are there. Of course, we do a lot of tagging, satellite tracking tags, internal tags to identify them. We're having a lot of really good luck with internal transmitters. So all around the Gulf and the Atlantic, all kinds of researchers studying different things have put receivers in the water. And those receivers listen for these acoustic tags we put in sawfish. So the tags are about the size of a AAA battery, and we actually implant them in the belly of a sawfish, cut a small opening, insert the transmitter and sew them up, send them on their way. And these transmitters, they'll ping for about 10 years. And anytime they swim past one of these receivers, that receiver will record the date, time, and this transmitter number. So we're able to get some really good long-term movement information. This is kind of like the sun pass of the sea is how I equate it. So if any of you have the little white box transponder in your car, that's the equivalent of these transmitters. And then you drive through the sun pass, and the receiver, which is overhead, detects your transponder or this tag and records the date, the time, and your tag number. And so that's how these transmitters work as well in the water. So I mentioned that we count the teeth on the left and the right side of the saw. Again, the smalltooth sawfish here in the United States has 20 to 29 on either side. They very rarely will have the same number. on each side, which is neat. These are actually not real teeth. These are modified scales called dermal denticles that are on the rostrum here. And then we take a bunch of samples. We draw blood to look at stress, reproductive hormones. We take a fin clip. We have a colleague up in Chicago at the Field Museum who's developing a family tree of sawfish for us. So we can take a little piece of the fin about the size of your pinky fingernail, send that to him in Chicago, and he's building this beautiful family tree for us, helping us get an idea of how many sawfish are still out there, which we don't know yet. We also sometimes collect parasites, and we collect their feces in order to figure out what they're feeding on. So normally for sharks, when you want to see what they're feeding on, sharks naturally can avert their stomach, get rid of bones and other things that they can't digest. So we can take advantage of that as researchers, and we can either reach in or through their mouth to their stomach and pull their stomach out, kind of like putting a sock inside out, and collect everything from the stomach and identify it. Or we can do gastric lavage, where we put a tube in the mouth and run water in there, which will flush everything out of their stomach. Well, we can't do that on sawfish because they're protected species. So we had to get creative and actually collected their feces when we were working them up. If they gave us any feces, we collected that and sent that off to analyze their diet. We have a whole lot of people around the world that are helping us do this research on sawfish. Too many to mention specifically, but a bunch of them listed here. A lot of people doing policy, outreach, conservation work. I have to mention the Sawfish Conservation Society. That's an open public Facebook group. If any of you are interested, you can go in there and share photos if you're lucky to see a sawfish, or go in there and see photos of other people lucky enough to see sawfish. And here's a program of that, the See a Saw project. So here are some of our colleagues with these humongous sawfish rostra that were found in museums. So we have the See a Saw project. If you ever see a rostrum in a museum or a restaurant or a bar or tackle shop or your friend's house, we would love to get a DNA sample of it from right here where it was cut from the body. That tissue retains DNA, and we can actually take a small sample of this or send you a kit for you to take a sample of it. And this is helping us compare the historic population of sawfish to the current population of sawfish. Really help give us a better idea if there were several different small populations of sawfish throughout the United States, or if they were one large population. That'll help give us an idea of where we might expect sawfish to return as they recover. So if you ever see one of these, go on to Sawfish Conservation Society and let us know, because we'd love to get a sample from it. So what we have learned in the last 20 years of doing our research, as I mentioned, sawfish are born about 2 feet long. They're very adorable, fully formed little miniature sawfish. It takes them about 7 years to reach sexual maturity and start reproducing. So that's another part of that low reproductive potential, and why we were taking sawfish out of the population at a greater rate than they were able to put them in. They have to be about 7 years old and about 11 or 12 feet long even before they start reproducing. So, you know, just imagine that, how big they have to be. So some people ask us why we don't have fish hatcheries for them like we do redfish. And this is part of the reason here, because they have to be so big before they start reproducing. And they only give birth to, 7 to 14 young, about a dozen young. And that's not very much output from these animals to replace when we were taking them out, unfortunately. Maximum size now is about 16 feet, the biggest that we've been able to catch in our surveys. We know from that analysis we did from their feces that they feed mostly on fish, mostly schooling fish like mullet, jacks, ladyfish predominantly. We think they're pregnant about 12 months. And two of our big questions that we still don't know, we don't know how long they live or how many of them are out there in the population. So you guys have probably typed in that question already, and we just don't know the answers to those. Those are two of our big big questions we're still trying to seek out. There have been a couple sawfish at SeaWorld in Orlando since the 80s. You can't always compare what happens in an aquarium to the natural world, but you know, those guys have been there for 40 years. But in the wild, since our research is only 20 years old, we still don't know the answer to that yet, or how many there are out there. So our current priorities, still research, still so much that we need to learn. We don't know when and where they mate, how they manage to find each other to reproduce. And, you know, is this an area that we need to protect for them to make sure that these areas are accessible for them to be able to mate? So hopefully from some of this long-term tracking that we're doing, we'll be able to get at some of that. But law enforcement is another priority. We still have a problem with people catching and killing sawfish, removing the rostra to keep the rostrum as a trophy souvenir. Here's one from Fort Lauderdale over by the museum. At one of the cleaning stations at a boat ramp, someone had kept this. They were obviously going to eat it because they left the head and the saw in a trash can there, unfortunately. So we know from that we still need to do a lot of outreach and education. Thank you guys for coming to learn about sawfish tonight. But we need to minimize the threats to sawfish from humans. And part of that is marine debris in the water. So here's a sawfish in Charlotte Harbor that was caught that had a strap wrapped around its head. Luckily, this fisherman was able to remove that. It had been on there so long that the sawfish was growing and that strap was cutting into the gills. Here's one from a shrimp trawler, unfortunately. A diver took this one over off the coast of Fort Lauderdale here. This sawfish was dead on the bottom, wrapped in a ghost gill net here, and was decaying on the bottom, unfortunately. These were two that were intercepted in an Everglades National Park creel survey out of Flamingo. These are two little baby sawfish that had been cleaned and dressed, so this person was obviously also going to eat them, but endangered species, catch and release only. So there's two things that we really need to do with our outreach efforts to minimize the threats from humans, and that's to promote safe handling and release guidelines for anglers and safe viewing guidelines for divers when they are fortunate enough to see a sawfish while they're diving. So social media is both good and bad for us and for sawfish. So it's bad because people want to get these pictures of them with sawfish, sitting on a sawfish or dragging a sawfish up on shore. You know, a lot of people will grab the tail of the sawfish and they'll pull it up on the beach, pull it up on shore. Because sawfish are raised and their gill slits are on the underside, you know, this is just filling those gills with leaves and rocks and sand and debris. So we try to respond to a lot of these posts with proper handling and release guidelines. But social media is good for us because we also monitor these posts to see when and where people are catching sawfish. That helps us target our field survey or respond if it's an area where one of our crews are. So if we get a cluster of reports, for example, from a fishing pier in Charlotte Harbor, that the FWC crew is going to be out there try to catch that sawfish so we can tag it, release it. And it'll also let us, you know, hang signs or educational information at these piers when we see catches. Oh, let me go back here. So if you do catch a sawfish, and we have all these materials that we usually give out at these talks, but you know, we ask that you keep the sawfish in the water. Don't use any gaffs or ropes to secure it. Just cut the line as close to the hook as you can get. The hook will rust out. Obviously, don't remove the saw. The sawfish uses that saw to find food. So it has sensory pores all along the underside of the rostrum that it kind of uses like a metal detector to sense small fish. Or it'll lay on the bottom with the saw up into the current with the water flowing over it this way, and it can actually detect fish and other things. So they need that saw for detecting and finding food. But so those are the guidelines. If you catch one, this is to keep you safe and to keep the sawfish safe if you are lucky enough to catch one. For divers, we are starting to develop some really cool materials for divers. We're getting these amazing photographs over off the Atlantic coast from sawfish. Oh my gosh, these beautiful pictures. So thank you, Richard Apple and Lee Denecker, for these photographs, beautiful photographs of sawfish. I'm so jealous that these people have seen sawfish while they're diving. So when you're diving, if you are lucky enough to see a sawfish, just keep your distance. Try not to disturb it. Try not to taste it. You know, sawfish are there in that area for a reason. They could be recovering. They could be resting. So we need to make sure that we don't have divers chasing them repeatedly away from an area where they want to be. We have to say, don't feed them or touch them. We've seen some videos of people trying to feed sawfish. This can't be safe for divers if you get whacked by that saw. And of course, you know, don't try to sit on it or ride it. But just enjoy it. Oh my gosh, I'm again so jealous of these people that have seen these sawfish. Here's another beautiful picture from over in the Atlantic of some sawfish. But so whether you catch a sawfish, see a sawfish, if you're just walking on a pier and you see a sawfish, we ask that you let us know. Again, this will help us target our field surveys. It helps us monitor the population and see where they are and when they're in certain areas. But it also helps us to determine if the management actions that we're taking are effective, if the population is recovering. So the information that we get from anglers and divers is so helpful to us and really imperative to help us ground truth what is actually happening in the water. There's only a handful of us that are doing research, but when we collect all the information from everybody who's recreating on the water, it really helps us get a better idea of what's actually happening in the water. So we thank everybody who has ever reported sawfish to us. So the future outlook, unfortunately, the largetooth sawfish is most likely locally extinct. That's the one that was always more common in the western Gulf of Mexico and in Texas. Again, we haven't seen that one for 60 years. Unfortunately, we've probably lost that one. There's some groups doing some research in Mexico, just south of us, where we would expect largetooth to come from, and they haven't seen any. And so unfortunately, there's very few of them hanging on in Central and South America of the largetooth. So I don't expect that we'll see that one here in the United States again. The smalltooth sawfish, fortunately, is starting to recover. We're actually starting to see some very encouraging signs from that gillnet ban that happened in 1995 and from the state of Florida in 1992, making both species of sawfish catch and release only. I think we're starting to see a lot of improvement in the population as a result of those measures that were taken back in the 90s. And then, of course, the listing in 2003. And Everglades National Park is imperative for sawfish. So I think the smalltooth sawfish, when I showed you those maps, that red area that was in South Florida, that's centered around Everglades National Park, this vast expanse of natural habitat, no commercial fishing in there. So Everglades National Park, that area kind of provided a refuge for sawfish when they were being caught in the mid-1900s everywhere else. And so keeping Everglades National Park is imperative for us to conserve and to recover smalltooth sawfish now, since that is a core area for the species historically and currently. We've done a lot of research. We've learned a lot. We still have a lot more to learn, but we've made progress. And fortunately, people are becoming a lot more aware that sawfish exist in Florida and that they're endangered, and that they're catch and release only. So we're seeing some promising signs for that as well. So I'm going to show you this video real quickly. Yeah. We made this video 3 years ago for the 15th anniversary of Sawfish Bank Festival.
Tonya, if excuse my dog howling, if you're able to hear me, I think you didn't enable the sound sharing for the video.
Okay.
At first, I thought it was a lot of really amazing pictures. I didn't realize it. I didn't realize there was sound until I saw your interview.
There was. Okay, well, we'll skip it. It's available on YouTube. If you just go on YouTube and search for Sawfish Recovery, you can get that video and watch it. That's right.
Thank you.
Thanks for interrupting me. Sorry about that. I can hear just fine here, but okay. So I'm going to leave you here with some of my favorite slides. So now that you know what a sawfish is, I promise you're probably going to see a sawfish or a sawfish rostrum somewhere. So I have a few slides here of sawfish and pop culture again, just to show you how common sawfish used to be. Here is a video game called Octageddon. There's this little octopus who's out to destroy the world. He has a different weapon in each one of his tentacles, and one of those weapons is a sawfish here that he uses to saw things down. Old TV show Magnum PI has sawfish rostrum here. Batman is a part bet. If anyone's seen Pirates of the Caribbean, the Ghost Pirates, they used sawfish rostra as weapons. Law and Order Criminal Intent, an episode here had a sawfish rostra. A TV show called Episodes here. So if you guys ever see a sawfish rostra, please email me, let me know, or post it in the Sawfish Conservation Society, because it's so fun when we see pictures of people who see sawfish rostra in places. The movie Blade Runner, Point Break, they had a sawfish rostrum in their party house on the beach. My husband actually spotted this one recently in Silicon Valley, Coconut back here. An old Tom Hanks Halle Berry movie had several sawfish rostra here. And my personal favorite movie of all time, Jaws, Quint had 2 sawfish rostra in his fishing cabin. He actually had one of each species. So here is a largetooth sawfish rostra. You can tell it's much brighter at the base here than it is at the tip. And here's a smalltooth sawfish rostra hanging here. Great movie. So I'm going to leave you with this. This is my last slide here. Thank you all for coming, but if you want to learn more about sawfish or follow with our research, I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram at Coastal Elasmos here. I have a monthly newsletter that I send out by email. You can join that from my website or from Facebook. The second ones listed here are the U.S. Sawfish Recovery Team, again on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Sawfish Recovery. These posts are more about the management, the policy, the Endangered Species Act side of things. Sawfish Conservation Society I've mentioned a few times. They're also on social media if you want to follow along for some cool research updates from everybody around the world. Photos, videos of people when they catch or see sawfish, and people share those sawfish rostra and pop culture. Here's my phone number and my email address. If you have any burning sawfish questions that you want to ask, or let me know if you ever see a sawfish rostrum. And with that, I am going to take some questions. I think I still have some time to take some questions.
Tonya, that was fantastic. I actually learned so much, and I'm sure everybody else on here did.
Okay.
I did see a lot of really good questions come up during your presentation. I'll go ahead and share those with you if you'd like to respond. Great.
Absolutely.
Excellent. So I will go from the top down in the list. Let's see. You did answer Sean Tupper. He asked about their teeth, and you did say they are actually scale dermal denticles.
Yes.
Let's see. When do baby sawfish actually get their teeth on the rostrum? And you know, at what age do those form?
Very good question. So those teeth actually form during development. So when they're an embryo forming in the mother, those teeth are formed. And the number of teeth on the rostrum is set. So when they're born at 2 feet long, they have the same number of teeth on either side of the rostrum when they're born as they do when they're full grown. So when they're born, here's a great photograph. I hope you guys can see this. The teeth are here and they're formed. But to protect mom during birth and to protect the babies from each other, these teeth are covered in what we call a sheath. It's this really thick gelatinous goo here that covers these teeth during birth. And then this will dissolve out pretty quickly, so the sawfish can then use those teeth for finding and catching food. Another interesting thing I didn't mention about these teeth, these modified scales on the rostrum here, these grow continuously throughout the life of the animal. So like our fingernails, our fingernails grow constantly throughout our life. We'll break them, we'll chip them. Same thing with the teeth on this rostrum. They'll grow continuously. They will break them and chip them when they're slashing at fish, but those teeth will grow back. And if you see a sawfish in an aquarium, sometimes they have really long, gnarly teeth because they're fed and they don't have to hunt for their food. They don't naturally break those teeth sometimes in aquarium. But as long as the sawfish retains the pulp cavity down here where that tooth is formed, that tooth will grow continuously throughout the life of the animal as it's being worn. Great question.
Wow, wow, and really interesting answer. Thank you. Kiefer asked a question, if sawfish have ever reproduced in captivity in aquariums.
Oh, good question. At one facility, yes, at Atlantis in the Bahamas, they've had a couple litters of pups that were born there. And so if anyone's ever been there, or when we can travel again, they have 4 large sawfish. They're all about 15 feet long in the open ocean lagoon that they have there. And though they've had 2 litters that were born there, and they still have 4 of those offspring in a different pond on their facility. So what's unique about Atlantis is that it's all outdoors. And so, sawfish get the temperature changes, the season change, whatever it might be that cues them to reproduce. An interesting thing about sharks and rays, though, is that they have the ability to store sperm. So they can mate, and the females can actually store that sperm to use at a later time. So we don't know if those sawfish in Atlantis mated in Atlantis, or if she had mated and stored that sperm. So we are actually looking at the genetics of the sawfish that are there in Atlantis and the offspring to determine if they mated while they were there, or if she had mated before she was brought into the facility and had that sperm stored. But that's the only facility where sawfish have given birth. Great question.
Wow, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a really good question on here from Kennedy, and I know you did get into it in your last couple of slides, but did you have anything additional to add about how people can be advocates for sawfish protection?
Oh, good question, Kennedy. One of the most important things that we've learned through our research, a grad student with Florida State University did her project on stress physiology of sawfish. So I mentioned when we catch sawfish, we draw blood from them. And one of the things that we look at are those stress hormones. Just from the act of being caught on a rod and reel and fought, how stressed is that sawfish when it's brought to the boat? And thankfully, we learned from that research that they aren't very stressed. So because they're a ray and they spend most of their time sitting on the bottom, this is probably what they do when they're caught on a long line or something like that. They sit on the bottom. So we know that if sawfish are handled and released properly, that they can survive interacting with humans for fishing. So one of the biggest things that the public can do is to handle them properly if they catch them, or interact with them properly while they're diving, but also help us spread the word to everybody else. Because, like we said at the beginning of this, we all live in Florida, and I think 2 people here maybe have seen sawfish. So, and we're in the core area where they are. So, I mean, that tells you how rare they are as well. But, just helping us get the word out to everybody, being an advocate for sawfish, being an advocate for sawfish conservation and for research really helps us. And like I said, the information that we get from the public is so valuable to our research. I mean, I can't even emphasize enough how important the information is that we get from the public to help us target our field surveys. We have limited resources. Thankfully, Save Our Seas is one of my funders for the research that I'm doing here in Tampa Bay. But we have, we have limited resources. And so when we get information from the public about a sawfish seen somewhere, we kind of try to hedge our bets and go try to catch that one. And so that really, really helps us a lot, the information that we get from the public. Good question, Kennedy.
Yeah, fantastic. Just a couple more questions. I'm going to combine my own question with this one too.
Okay.
One question is, you did kind of touch on this a little bit in your presentation. It was about reintroducing sawfish into the wild in different areas, maybe where it might be beneficial. And I also wanted to ask if any of researchers have been able to find sort of a healthy population target. So, and kind of where are we now in terms of that percentage? Great
questions. So I'll take the first one, the first half first. So reintroduction, since we assume that we've lost the Largetooth sawfish since it's been 60 years since it's been here, we're not sure if the sawfish that we have in Florida will ever repopulate and go back to Texas naturally. Are they going to cross the Mississippi River and go back to Texas, which is where I'm from. So I would love for sawfish to go back to Texas. And so one of the things, on our long range plan is possibly to reintroduce sawfish to some of these areas where historically they were found. But we need some answers to some valuable questions first. So one of them we are going to get from those genetics. So from the fin clips that we send in from the animals that we catch and from the DNA we get from those dried rostra, we're going to be able to tell historically how many populations there were in certain areas. So if it was one big population of smalltooth sawfish from Texas to North Carolina, then we might expect the ones from Florida to repopulate there naturally. But if there was a separate population in Texas than there was from Florida, then we wouldn't expect them to go back naturally and we would have to reintroduce them. However, right now the problem is we're not comfortable enough that there are enough sawfish in Florida to remove any from the population. So, we would even like to do some captive experiments on animals. A lot of times people will, bring sharks into a flume to do some experiments on them and determine, what salinity is best for them or what water temperature, helps them digest food the most, things like that. And we don't even want to remove any from the population right now for us to do any research on them. So we definitely don't want to pull any out of the Everglades or South Florida to transport them to Texas or Georgia or North Carolina at this point. Because right now our priority is saving all of the ones that we have left. But as we start to see some more, it is something that we would consider down the road.
Okay, great. And then one final question. Kiefer asked if they can regenerate their rostrum. And I know you had mentioned that their tooth-like dermal denticles could be regenerated, or that they grow throughout their life, but Kiefer wanted to see if they could regenerate that entire rostrum.
Unfortunately, Kiefer, no, they cannot. So while they can regrow the teeth, these are the teeth that are like our fingernails growing constantly, they cannot regenerate the saw. If the entire saw is removed, like these two animals, this is actually not even the same animal here. This one was up in Jacksonville, this one was in Tampa Bay. But if the saw is removed, that will not regenerate, that will not grow back. And like I mentioned before, the underside of the saw here is lined with all of the sensory pores that the sharks have on their nose, the ampullae of Lorenzini, and this is how the sawfish finds their food, finds their prey. So we unfortunately see a lot of photographs of people catching sawfish that have had the saw removed. This is healed over. The sawfish is starving to death because it's not able to find food. And we have some photographs of some that look pretty healthy, but for the most part, they're gonna starve to death when the saw is removed because they don't have that ability to sense their food, but also to catch their food. So they use the saw. There's some great videos on YouTube. They'll use the saw to swipe at schools of fish really fast, and it's quite amazing. So they'll stun a fish or impale a fish, and that's how they catch their food. So they use the saw to sense their food, but they also use it to catch their food. And so taking that rostrum off, which will not grow back, unfortunately, takes the sawfish's ability to feed away from them, and they likely starve to death, sadly.
Wow. Well, at least you had some good news about recovery in numbers in your presentation.
Yes.
This has been a little daunting to watch, you know, all of the overfishing and to see the population decline, but there's hope. So thank you for sharing that. And Tonya, thank you so much tonight for joining us for our Save Our Seas Distinguished Speaker series. This was incredibly informative, and I'm sure everybody else on here tonight absolutely enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you.
Yeah, I hope we can do it in person sometime.
I cannot wait, and we will definitely ask you back once we're able to. But thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you everybody for joining us tonight, and again, thank you to the Save Our Seas Foundation for your support, and also for supporting Tonya's important research. I'm glad we're able to bring that connection together here with everybody and sharing your research with them. And be sure to please visit mods.net and figure out and see where we have our next Save Our Seas Foundation Distinguished Speaker Series next first Thursday in September. So we look forward to seeing everybody back then. Thanks again, Tonya.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.